Five. Got new bowl.
Yes.
Three now. Well, I got my shot about a week and a half ago. And I was feeling fine. I got to Saturday morning. It was real dry. Just stopped up all over. Congested. And just ate. Good morning.
And that's when you call me.
I think they tried to talk to the manager. It's not our problem.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think? You got
I went to the doctor.
cleared up.
Yes?
Buddy, she don't believe in using no heat.
Oh, really?
You know about the I felt bad
It's
a couple of
easy
weeks.
to not remember. It's not, you know, can't always
And I finally went to the doctor.
That's kind of my fault. Always put more clothes on.
Hospital, I want to go.
Dragon Lens. Yeah, but I mean, that was, instead of trying.
That's good.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the City of Griffin Board of Commissioners Morning Workshop on October 25, 2022. First item is the presentation of the 2022 annual report from Stormwater. Bryce Martin will be here to address. And Bryce, great job this week with your team. Stream cleanup. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And good morning, Commissioners. Good morning, Mayor. It's hard to believe we're already back doing this again. It seems like we just did it a few months ago. Doing end of year reporting. So I think we had another successful year in stormwater. I just want to cover a couple of highlights that we had from this year. So we closed out the 3-year GFA loan, the $4.5 million loan. That project closed out last month. All the construction did. We're able to do about 60 cross drain replacements. Golf course project, Memorial Park culvert rehab, all that stuff was completed over the last 3 years. You know, despite those labor shortages and supply chain issues and all that good stuff, we were still finished on time and actually finished under budget. We were able to kind of shift some things around and get quite a few more projects in there than we expected. Davey Resource Group came in and completed our hazardous tree assessment, and we're kind of currently working through those lists of trees to get some of those down. And that list was much shorter than years past because we've been able to stay on top of that. So we just really had a few of those to get down. Sort of on that note, we celebrated 30 years as a tree city this year. I think you recall back in February we did that. And so this year we collected 210 water quality samples and engaged in about 25 outreach and educational programs. We had 2 stream cleanups, like the Mayor mentioned. One was just this past weekend. Brought in about 150 volunteers and cleaned up over 3 tons of trash from our streams in town. So on the operations side of things, we cleaned up over 5 miles of ditches, 3,000 storm drains, 2 miles of pipes, and over 90 work orders. And I'd certainly be remiss if I didn't finish up and mention, you know, the loss of Brant this year, Dr. Keller, what an influence he was for me personally and for stormwater here in Griffin. So he's certainly going to be missed. And, you know, I find myself often wanting to mention things to him or show him some of these projects we finished up. Of course, he's not here to do that. And so I miss having him around. So if there's not any questions, I think that's what I've got for the year. So.
Any questions from the board? Thank you, Mr.
Thank you
Martin, for your service. That's great.
Thank you.
Next item is to present a cost of service study prepared by data analysis with ECG to provide recommendations on recovery. Necessary updates to the electric rate tariff. Electric Cities of Georgia consultant Sarah Leonard will address. Welcome, Sarah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So just let me know if you can't hear me. So I was here back in 2017, and the focus of that rate proposal was Vogel. We had a 10-year projection of Vogel. There was a multi-year rate plan, taking long-term strategic rate plan for Vogel. That is not my focus today. The reason for that is that I don't currently have a 10-year projection for Vogel. That's recent. The latest projection was done in December 2021. And it doesn't even include the latest Vogel delay. So I wasn't comfortable looking at rates, say, for 2024 and going out beyond that because of that. It is expected to be out, I think, in January, the 10-year projection from MEAG. So that at that time would be appropriate to take a longer term look at the rates, look at what the Vogel costs are, and update that rate strategy that we started with the 2018 rates. So what this rate adjustment is focused on are the increase in power costs that have already occurred. So if you think about the power costs back in fiscal year 19 to fiscal year 21, say, they were in the ballpark of 34, 35 million. Well, now it's up at least 2 million, 37, 38 million or higher, especially even if you look at it without a transfer of the excess sales to the MCT funds, it's still up at something like 37 million. So that's a 2 million increase in costs. But in addition to that, I think everyone knows there's a lot of cost volatility going on right now. Fuel costs, transformer costs are up, everything. That really isn't the focus of this presentation. And the reason for that is that when we do rates, we really want to look at the costs that we know, permanent costs. I don't really know with the current volatility what's more temporary, what the magnitude is, what's here to stay, what might go down in 6 or 12 months. So I'm really trying to focus on the cost increase that has already occurred versus the current volatility. It might be we have more information next year when the Vogel review is going on, and that might be able to be more incorporated at that time. So really that is a more separate conversation, I would say. So also on the revenue side, I feel that the sales revenues have not kept up with the cost increases. And I have a table showing some budget revenues versus actual. In the history that I have seen, typically your actual revenues come in under budget. And percentage-wise, it might not be significant, but it can be a fairly significant magnitude of difference. And those numbers, I just wanted to mention, I pulled them from unaudited financials, or the 22 number comes from the sales report. So it might be a little different than numbers you've seen before, but that is why I really was trying to just illustrate something. But I do want to mention that even if I looked at the 22 unaudited financials, and the number was a bit higher than the one listed, say 50 million, there's still quite a difference between what actually came in fiscal year 22 and what's in the budget. It's about a $2 million difference in sales revenues. And when I'm looking at the sales and I develop my own sales revenue for doing rates, what I see is that some of that growth that is assumed seems to be delayed or not there. So just as an example, there is growth in customer choice. There are some customers that are increasing their kilowatt hour usage, but that is a really low revenue driven rate because they're on a special rate until they get rolled off onto standard rates. There is growth in residential. It does look like it's coming, but it also seems like it wasn't fully in place in July 2023. It doesn't look like there's 200 new homes fully occupied quite yet. But I do feel like it will probably come over the course of the year, but there was 300,000, I believe, incorporated in the budget revenues. And the industrial growth, those two customers, my understanding is they're not really generating significant revenue. And that was maybe approximately 680,000 put into the budget revenues. So that's, a little bit of why there's a difference in what's in the budget versus what I'm calculating. So on the next slide, what I show is my actual calculation. I wanted to give like an overview of why I see a need in a rate adjustment right now. So So for the calculation, on the left column is the fiscal year 23 budget. And embedded in that, there are $2.4 million for MCT funds. That was an assumption that was part of the budgeting process. And I've included it on both sides. The ECG 2023 is just my calculation for 2023, and I'll just talk through the differences in my calculations. So for the sales revenue, like I said, for every rate work, for all the rate work I do, I always calculate the sales revenues starting from customer level billing data, and I put in assumptions for growth if there's maybe any kind of customer change, for example, a customer choice moving off, I incorporate all those kinds of things. The other revenues, my number is a bit higher than the budget number, and that's because for the penalty revenues, I based it on actual history versus what's in the budget. For the excess sales, I have included that in the power cost number, so it's not showing on the revenue side. So if you were to, so that means it doesn't assume that there's a transfer of the excess sales to the MCT fund, so that would be an additional cost. For the operating expense, I have included the compensation increase. I just did a prorated amount for the compensation increase that was done this year. And it was equal to about $160,000 increased in the personnel costs. And the other changes in the power costs, I've added about $360,000 to the power cost. I am including a little bit of the current volatility there and offsetting it by some PCA revenues on the revenue side. But for the most part, it's not incorporated in here. So based on those calculations, the net revenue that I'm coming up with is a negative 2.1 million, and that's what the rate adjustment is based on. It's about 4%, 4.1% of total sales revenues. So that's how I calculated the number. And at this point, I just wanted to see if there were any questions yet. No? Okay. So if you look on the next slide, I'm just rolling that rate adjustment into the revenues, and it just zeroes out the net revenue. So you may not completely agree with my specific assumptions, but there is a need for additional revenues. I'm just going to leave it at that. And the goal is to get started. Again, when you do a rate adjustment, it's cumulative, so it helps spread it out over time. So the sooner, the better. Any delays to doing that just means a higher increase in the future. So I wanted to talk through the cost of service in a little detail because this forms the basis of how I did the rate adjustments. So when you look at the percents I used, you might wonder why I did that, and it really is based on this slide right here. So cost of service is an allocation of your electric expenses across all the rate classes. And the reason why an allocation is needed is because for the most part, you don't know, you can't directly attribute electric costs to specific classes. And there are exceptions, like a lighting expense would go right to the lighting class, but for the most part, you don't know which expenses would be attributed to specific classes. So we do an allocation that's based on an industry standard methodology. And what it gives you as a result is it allocates the expenses across all the rate classes. There's an allocation of the other revenues, and then it also allocates the general fund transfer. So the key result is a margin by rate class. It's essentially you're taking the sales revenues of that rate class and allocation of the other revenues, such as penalty revenues. You're allocating the costs and you're allocating the transfer. So revenues minus costs minus transfer is your margin. And that is margin dollars. The graph that you see is a margin percent. And we use the percent just because some classes are really small, some classes are much larger, so it's an easier way to compare the margins rather than just the dollar magnitude. So the table at the bottom shows the margin dollars for each rate class. And this is based on the shortfall that I just showed. And the margin percent is what's in the graph. So that's what a cost of service is. So if you look at the graph, you can see in the left column is the total, and then each rate class starting with residential, small power non-demand, school non-demand, over all the way through over to UGA. Now the key result that jumps right out is, to me, the residential class and the school non-demand class. You can clearly see that they're being subsidized by commercial classes. This very common result for the residential class. The other thing that is pretty notable is the large power, which is really high. They're doing your larger commercial customers are doing the subsidizing. Their margins are quite high. Also to note, the UGA account, that's been on a special rate for a very long time. As far as I know, it's never been changed. They have a fixed power cost adjustment, so they're not picking up, if there's a change in power cost adjustment, they haven't picked up any of that. So they are a little bit out of alignment with the other commercial classes in the, so this, I wanted to talk about the schools a little bit. When I was here in 2017, we discussed, eventually moving schools to the regular commercial rates. Most utilities do not have a special school rate. The schools are being subsidized. Typically, when we look at this cost of service result, and you're looking at commercial classes, the margins should be in a descending pattern. So your smallest commercial classes would have the highest margins, then the medium customers would be below that, and then the largest commercial customers we like to see have the smallest margins. And really, this result is in reverse of that. And the same goes with the schools. The school demand is showing a positive margin, but it's much lower than your medium and large power customer margin. They're both being subsidized, they're on lower rates. So when I'm looking at the rates, what I'm trying to do is reduce some of those subsidies. So what that means is that I'll start with the school rates. Initially, I wanted to move them to the commercial class this time, but it was too much. It was like 20%. It was just too much of a change. Just the process is to move them, over time so that they can be moved to commercial rates eventually, and it wasn't the time to do it this year. So I gave them a 7% increase. It's like 3% more than the average, so it's a little bit more than average. Really, it should be even more, but because everything's so crazy right now, I'm trying to balance it. It's kind of a compromise. So the school rates I gave 7%, 3% over the average increase. Residential, they really should also be getting 7 to 10% increase, but I understand residential customers are always a big concern. And in addition, things are especially crazy this year with all the cost increases. So the compromise there was to just give them a 5% increase, which is 1% over the average. Makes a really small step towards reducing the subsidies, but any movement is a good thing. At UGA, I gave a 5.5% increase. Again, they have never seen a change in rate that I know of. So to give them a little bit higher increase, but it's a small customer, so I didn't want to make it higher than that.
When you say they have never received an increase, never as of how long?
Since 29, right?
I don't know exactly when that rate,
A long time,
a long,
1999?
long time.
long time. So I'll get to the changes I made for that account when we get to the rates. So the small power non-demand, I gave a little bit higher than average rate because they really should have a higher margin than say medium and large power. The city, I guess, just gave the average percent change, and for large industrial and large power, I gave the smallest increases because they are just to make some adjustments, especially the large power. I wanted to get that a little bit more in alignment because their margin is so high in cost of service result. I wanted to mention just on the industrial margin, it's showing it exactly break even, but there are a couple discounts, customers with discounts in that rate. So if you took out that discount, they really would have a higher margin of about 4%. Because when you first look at it, you think, well, the industrial should get a larger increase, but really there's some discounts that will roll out eventually, and if you incorporate them, you can see they're really closer to the large industrial rate, just a bit lower. So, but still, we would want their margin to be higher than the large industrial margin. So that's, I'm trying to explain why I put those decreases in as they are, because they're kind of vary depending on the class. And medium power just gave the average rate increase, 4.2, and you'll see that when we go through the rates. And what I show on the next slide is the change. So if you look at what this shows, the next slide shows the change with the adjustment built in. And it's not significant because those are small, fairly small. But you can see it reduces the residential subsidy a little bit. You can see the industrial moves to positive, the school non-demand margin is reduced. So this is kind of showing the result of the rate adjustment to the cost of service. And I know that's a lot of information. Are there any questions about the cost of service? No. So just generally, I have a 1-year rate plan with a 4% rate adjustment. There's some changes to fixed charges, meaning your base charges and demand charges. And reducing the power cost adjustment, and this isn't the latest one, this is what I'm calling the baseline, was 1.95 cents. I am reducing that to 0.5 cents and rolling those revenues into the standard rates. But like I said, it's quite possible that in fiscal year 23, the power cost adjustment might need to be something different than what I'm showing here because of all the volatility going on right now.
I have a question.
Okay.
Second bullet point, second bullet point, increased fixed charges. Is this in addition to the 4.1% rate adjustment, or is it rolled into it?
It's rolled into it, so it's not on top of that.
Okay.
So what it means is if you bump up some of the base charges, their energy rates would be lower than they might have been otherwise.
Okay.
So it's kind of it's all rolled in. But a good question. And again, I'm just doing the 1 year because hopefully we'll get an updated 10-year projection from MEAG in January. And I wanted to mention at this point that there are a lot of.
Back to that reduced PCA, what's the PCA?
Oh, sorry, power cost adjustment.
Okay.
A power cost adjustment is a rate that applies to all retail customers. It's a cent per kilowatt hour charge. It's meant as a temporary rate for changes in cost. But what happens a lot is that it gets increased to just collect revenues rather than doing a rate increase. It just gets bumped up and it stays up. So, but it is meant as a temporary adjustment, and because it's applied to every, except for in this case, UGA, which had a fixed PCA, it really applies to every kilowatt hour, so it hurts the largest customers the most because it's a 100% variable charge.
Thank you.
So there are a lot of rate increases going on right now. There's a lot of power cost adjustment increases because most utilities have some kind of power cost adjustment. It might be called something else, like Georgia Power might call it a fuel cost recovery. Georgia Power has a rate case right now. I wanted to mention it. It's filed, it has not, the decision is in December, but they've put in for a 12% increase over 3 years. A lot of that is in year one. It's looking like 6 to 7% increases for the customers across the board. It doesn't include an increase that's already been adopted for Vogtle and Georgia Power. It also doesn't include changes to fuel cost recovery or that power cost adjustment. And they put in for that in February, so I would expect that will be an increase as well.
You said 6%? 6%?
6 to 7 in 2023. And then the other increases would be smaller in year 2 and 3. So, and what I have done is I included, for the residential and small commercial customer bill impacts, I included Georgia Power's current and proposed. So you can see what it looks like at different usage levels. I also wanted to mention Central Georgia. I was working on a power cost adjustment increase for another utility, and we were looking at Central Georgia. Central Georgia, you have your residential class, you have a $20 base charge, which I did not change. It could go up a little bit, but I felt like, given everything, it was good to keep it the same. Central Georgia has a $40 residential base charge, which I had not seen before. And they have for years had a zero power cost adjustment, and they have bumped it up. In July, it was 0. In September, it was 2.249 cents. So they bumped their rates up 2.249 cents because of, I'm sure, power cost increases they are facing. So that is just an example. I mean, we have Georgia Power, Central Georgia. There's a lot of that going on. Not every utility is impacted by all the cost stuff going on right now, but a lot of them are, and there's some significant cost increases going on. So I just wanted to mention that because, you know, it's important to keep in mind it's not just Griffin. And I have Georgia Power, so I know my bills will be going up. So let's look at the rates. So like I said, I did keep the base charge for residential the same. If I were to increase it, I might bump it up $1 or $2. But I was trying to sort of balance the increases. And you can see it, there's a 5% increase to the class. Georgia Power's base charges are still at $14, proposed as $15. So they're lower than Griffin's residential base charge. So that's why when you look at the bill impacts for the smaller usage, like 500 kilowatt hours per month, like an average residential customer uses about 1,000, say, 1,000 kilowatt hours per month. For 500 kilowatt hour usage, the base charge impacts that bill more. So that's why if you look at your bill impacts compared to Georgia Power's, yours are higher, but that's really because you have a $20 base charge. Georgia Power's is only at 14. So you can see in the table to the right of the rates that I'm showing for summer at the top and winter at the bottom, there's different usage levels. And this matches what's in the Public Service Commission rate comparison for residential that they do twice a year. 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 kilowatt hours a month. So like I said, 1,000 would be a typical average. You can see the Griffin, the current bill amount, under the proposal, the 2023 proposed, and then Georgia Power current and Georgia Power proposed. And you'll see that yours, for summer rates, those bill impacts are still less than Georgia Power's, but winter rates, you're a bit higher. And then again, for the 500 blocks, because of the base charge difference, that your bill impacts are a little bit higher. I calculated some for Central Georgia, which are not there, but just to give you an idea, for Central Georgia at 500 kilowatt hours, because of that $40 base charge, their bill is $93.85. And their 1,000 kilowatt hours is quite close to the Georgia Power proposed number of $147. And then, but for their larger kilowatt hour bills, then they begin to be lower.
What did you say our average kilowatt hour bill?
For residential, it's usually about 1,000. I don't remember what it is exactly for Griffin, but it can be like 900 to 1,100 usually over like a year. So it's a good way to gauge an average customer impact.
Do any MEAG cities have a set rate without the winter or summer in terms of a blended rate?
There are some. I think not many. The reason for it is costs really are higher in the summer. It is, having one rate does stabilize revenues a little better, but I have one actually now who they went to a year-round rate, but because they want to better match the rate comparisons, because what happens if you have a year-round rate, then you always you look a lot worse.
One way or the other.
You look a lot worse in the winter. So they actually we're talking about going back to a seasonal rate because they really want to get their because they've had some high rates, they really want to start looking better compared to all the other utilities. So that's why, and really the costs are higher in the summer, so it makes sense. But, I mean, it's an option, I could do that, but it does stabilize revenues. And maybe it's easier to understand for the customers, I don't know, but they tend to use more and the costs are higher, generally speaking, in the summer. And yeah, so that's it. And note that as far as the power cost adjustment, like I said, I reset it to 0.5 cents or 0.005. So let's look at small power. So small power is generally commercial customers who use less than 3,000 kilowatt hours a month. So your smaller, really smaller commercial. And this is an example where I bumped the base charge up to $30, but that is kind of rolled into the overall increase of 4.7%. And I have the Georgia Power impacts on the right side of the table, and I've only included, again, you have a summer winter rate. So that's a little less common, like Georgia Power has a year-round small commercial rate. You could move to a year-round rate. And it's like all kilowatt hours are under the same charge. And what you see, like Georgia Power's increase for these customers is at 7% for the different usage levels I'm showing. And for yours, it's a little bit bigger increase for the smaller user because of that base charge change, but they get some benefit out of the energy rate. And Georgia Power's base charge is actually $36. So that's that. So the school, when I was like 5 years ago, I think we created the school non-demand rate and the school demand rate, and that was in an effort to move towards the commercial. So the usage cutoff is, I think, 100 kW. So all the smaller school accounts are on this school non-demand rate. And this rate is really being highly subsidized. And what I did yesterday, and I did not realize this, I know I mentioned that most municipal utilities do not have a school rate, but Georgia Power does have a school rate. And so I looked at it, and it doesn't have any usage specifications. So it looks like all the schools would go on this rate. And when I did the comparison, across all usage levels, the school rate was higher than the commercial rate. So both for the smaller schools and for the bigger schools. So that was interesting to me. I did not realize that until yesterday, and I don't have a graph of that in the slides because I had to have them done, but across all usage levels, their school was higher because the school rates that the municipal utilities have are always subsidized lower rates. So that's a difference. But it made me realize that it is, I think, really you want to reduce the subsidies, and there are still some different special rates, not just for schools out there, but I was trying to work towards reducing them, but trying to do it without significant bill impacts, because that's part of it. It's always a balance when looking at the rates.
Is Southern Crescent included in the school rate, Jennifer? Or is that on the commercial?
I think so. I'm pretty sure, I'll check to see, but I'm not positive.
So it's public schools, state schools, if we had a private school?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I'll check.
Yeah.
She's going to check, she thinks so.
Is that how daycare centers work too, or no?
No,
Preschool systems?
not daycare center.
No,
Yeah, not daycare center.
There are some utilities who have special church rates. Try to move those to commercial too. So especially this rate is being really subsidized, which is what I kind of realized. And I did calculate the revenue impact on that, but it's really 7%. If you put them all together. So medium power, they're getting the average increase. These are, your medium power customers are bigger than the small commercial, but they're not the biggest, so they're up to 100 kW kilowatts. But so they're still relatively small. But one thing about commercial is you can charge them higher base charges and they have a demand charge, which is based on how much they're using at a point in time versus kilowatt hours, which are kind of what they're using over the whole month. It's more like a peak, their peak usage is the demand. And for medium power, it's really just the same rate, it's just an average increase. And I did bump the base charge up to $50. And instead of doing the table, I did a graph of a 50 kW commercial customer just to show how those rates look against Georgia Power's. In the graph, it's showing the average billed amount in cents per or it's dollars per kilowatt hours, and the usage across the bottom, 3650 kWh up to 36,500 kWh, and you can see Georgia Power's in the red. The dotted line is Georgia Power's proposed rate for that rate class. Griffin's current rate is in the black, and the proposed rate is in the blue. So there's some crossover. You're close to the current rate, a little bit higher for the higher load factor, higher users in this graph. So this is just to show some of the impact for the medium power. And so large power, again, I gave a lower increase to try to help bring their margin down at 2%, 2.1. Once I realized I wasn't going to be putting schools into commercial rates, I bumped the base charge up to $100 and the demand charge up to $7. So these are the reason I'm doing this too, again, to mention power costs are mostly fixed, electric costs are mostly fixed, like highly fixed, like often 80% fixed, 20% variable. And that means that even if you think about power costs, it's like a mortgage. Even if you bought nothing from the ag in kilowatt hours, you still would have to pay those fixed costs, right? So that's why we try to get the rates to be more fixed. You can't charge rates that are 80% fixed charges, but we try to move in that direction. So at least get more revenues that are fixed that you can count on, because if you have a very low, everything's still weather dependent. Say you have a year with very little lower kWh because there's not as much air conditioning, you lose all that revenue because so much of it is coming through the energy charges. So that's why we always try to bump up the base charge and the demand charges, as much as possible to help mitigate that and bring in more fixed revenue. So that's why we do that, and we started to do that with the 2018 rate plan, and kind of continue to do that where it makes sense. But I always like to do it in small steps too, because I don't want to have too large of an impact on any particular customers. And then I did a graph for the large power as well. And in this case, again, this kind of shows that large power has that very high margin, so the rates are pretty much all higher than Georgia Power's rates across all usage. It'd be good to bring it down over time. And that's a function of having a high power cost adjustment, because like I said, when that's high, it's applied to all kilowatt hours, and these are the customers that use the most kilowatt hours. So it's not a cost-based charge. It's really just meant for temporary adjustments to revenue. This school demand rate, again, I did a 7% increase, and I did bump up the base charge and demand charge for them, also to try to get that more in line with the commercial rates. It might take a couple iterations to get the school rates up there. So that's part of why I raised it for them, the base charges, is to get it closer to the commercial, but also because of what I just said as far as fixed, getting fixed charges up, because that's the cost structure. Industrial rate, 3.2% increase, no change to the, those are pretty high charges, base charge and demand charge, so no change there, it's just a very similar rate structure, same rate structure. And the graph, again, it just shows you for 250 kW industrial customer, and the industrial, it has a minimum 100 kW requirement, so not any industrial customer can be on it. And again, there's a crossover. Some places, the Griffin rates are higher, some places they're lower. And large industrial, these are a separate rate that was created for the largest industrial customers. So the cutoff is 1,500 kW, getting a 2.5% increase, an increase in the base charge from 200 to 250. And for that graph, what you can see is Georgia Power has their large power rates, but in their back pocket, they have the real-time pricing rate or RTP rate. And often what you might run into with these large customers is they have multiple facilities with different utilities, and they'll say, well, how come we're getting a 5-cent rate from Georgia Power? And it's because Georgia Power has this RTP rate that you can see at the bottom. That is meant to be based on the customer's actual load, but it's kind of a way they can handle it to provide some better rates for these large customers. So even if your rates aren't too far off the standard Georgia Power rates for some of these large customers, there's always this RTP rate that you're sometimes competing against, which is at the bottom.
Just quickly to answer your question from earlier, Southern Crescent is a standard commercial rate, it's not under the school rates. So they fall based on usage under small, medium, large, wherever.
So if UGA was treated.
They are tax exempt, but they are not under the school rate.
So that is,
But I mean, you got Southern Crescent with multiple buildings, it's paying higher rate than UGA.
so I know when I was here last time, there was an apartment building that was on a special rate, and I think it was agreed to move them. I mean, that is an option for UGA. I mean, I hadn't really looked at that, but if you felt like they do have some lower cost because they're off the substation, right? Or they do their own maintenance or something. Yeah,
UGA they do. not
that's what I mean, UGA they do, so there was a reason for this.
They have lower costs because of why?
They do their own
They
maintenance.
take care of their own maintenance. So we feed in on a primary metering inside the facility. That's all UGA on power lines, poles, everything.
So that's why. So the city rate, just gave it the average change, just a small bump up in the base charge. The UGA rate, what I did is I added in a base charge, bumped up the demand rates just to round them off. And this is an important part, is that I reset the PCA so that now they'll pay what everybody else is paying. And so it's set at 0.005, so if there is a change, they would be paying it as well. And lighting, just all charges get a 4% increase for lighting. So that is it. Are there any other questions? Been good questions.
Yes, in the perfect world, if you could set rates where everything was just shy of what Georgia Power was, I think we had, maybe a decade ago, had something that looked a little more favorable when you did the comparison, so that we were always below Georgia Power when they.
Right.
That would be the perfect world. So
Right.
you
And
could argue that.
it's hard to know how theirs will fall out because they also have the local cost increases and things. And there is some restructuring that could be done to make it a little more favorable, but that is hard because of the impacts. So in other words, there were some rates where you're close, but then up at the right end, your rates are higher, so you can kind of shift it so you have more fixed charges and lower the rates for, you know, that end of the customers, but often that impacts some of the other customers a lot too much, if you follow that. So if you kind of reduce it to match Georgia Power, you're gonna be increasing it a lot for somebody else. So that's what's kind of hard to balance.
And then once we get the 10-year projections with Vogel, we'll actually see the chart that shows where rate projections will be.
Right.
Where money that we'll have to transfer from the
Right.
competitive trust
I
savings.
think once we see what that is, we can look at that, you know, is there a need for more rate increase for that? How much funds might you need each year to balance it out? And like, you know, like I said, especially the first year for Vogel, the projections were always really high the first year of the cost, and then again, like that was 9 years, but in between, the Vogel costs typically settled out at a number, and that's kind of what you would shoot for. And you might have to use more funds the very first year or two, like you might need to use more in 2024.
There are other projects that are rolling off or their debt's been restructured.
Right.
They're gonna be active.
So there's so
So
many,
where the balance is.
Yeah,
so
there's-
we'll have a better
right, there's a lot of moving parts.
2030, 2032 vision of where
Yes.
we're going
Yes,
into the future.
that's my hope, especially it's in the budget to start Vogel 3 in April. And it appears that's on track for Vogel 3. So that, I think, also will help maybe firm up what the cost will be when that actually happens. But we'll see.
Any other questions?
All right, I know that was a lot of information. I'll leave
Well, thank
the,
you, Sarah. We appreciate you
All right.
coming out.
Yeah, thank
Look
you.
forward to further discussion.
okay, thank you.
Jennifer, do you have anything you need to add?
No, we just have this set to be voted on the first meeting in November. If you all don't have any major changes, but just kind of take it, digest it, because we do realize it's a lot of information. And just get back with us on anything that you might want to see changed, modified in any way, and I'll get with Sarah. But like I said, we do have this to be voted on as far as the tariff for next year, the first meeting in November.
This takes effect January of 23.
January, yes, that's correct.
Thank you. All right, item 3 is consider executive session pursuant to OCG 5014-21 for the purpose of consulting or meeting with legal counsel pertaining to pending potential litigation, settlement claims, administrative proceedings, and other judicial actions brought or to be brought by or against the agency or officer or employee, or in which the agency or any officer or employee may be directly involved, and pursuant to OCG section 5014-3B2 for the purpose of discussing or deliberating upon the appointment, employment, compensation, hiring, disciplinary action, or dismissal, or periodic evaluation or rating of a public officer or employee. We have a motion to close session. Motion from Mr. Zenza, second. Second by Ms. Murray. Thank you all for being here today. We'll see you all shortly.
I got my 2 minutes and I gotta run out the door.
You'll lose your comments, Jen.
I'll have staff. They'll have staff.
Second, come back to the session. All in favor, say aye. All right, final item on the agenda is discuss the 2022 Circle Street Patrick Spalding County Cities of Griffin, Orchardville, and Sunnyside. City Manager Jesse O'Connor.
Mayor, at this time, what we are going to do is amend our agenda tonight. We will vote on 3, as of right now, different agreements. One will be the lease agreement for Volunteer Park and City Park with the county. One will be an IGA for the use of Fairmont Park, and the other will be archivist and curator agreement. I hope that animal control and animal shelter is the only thing that remains. And we will be able to negotiate that in the next few days and get that back to you in a call meeting.
Any other questions or comments? We have motion to adjourn the meeting. Ms. Murray, motion, second by Mr. Tension. All in favor?
Easy peasy. Just easy peasy. So easy.
Tell me about it.
Really, it's not.